It started with a table. A table in Geneva, polished and heavy, flanked by flags of 3 European nations, France, Germany, and the UK, each diplomat sitting stiff-backed, clutching briefing folders like shields. Their faces were composed, but under that lacquered calm was panic. The kind of panic you only see when peace has begun to slip away and the only thing holding it in place is ceremonial protocol and bad coffee. The room smelled of nerves and cologne and the kind of desperation you don't admit aloud. Across the city, press teams waited with canned optimism, ready to report constructive talks or measured progress. But inside that room, it was different. Iran had come to the table, but only barely. Their demand was non-negotiable. Israel must halt airstrikes immediately. When that didn't happen, Iran walked. And with that, Geneva failed. And the world braced for impact. Welcome to What If Horizons. I'm your host. And today, we are staring down a future no one wants to believe is real, but may already be set in motion. This morning, Geneva's emergency diplomacy effort collapsed. European negotiators tried to contain the growing wildfire between Israel and Iran. But with Israeli fighter jets still striking Iranian infrastructure and Iranian nuclear scientists dying by the week, the Iranians refused further engagement. Their foreign minister called U.S. support for Israel a betrayal to diplomacy. And behind closed doors, they've made it clear, if the U.S. enters this war, whether directly or indirectly, every American base in the region becomes a target. That means al-Assad in Iraq, al-Dhafra in the UAE, Camp Buehring in Kuwait, possibly even ships in the Gulf. This is not rhetoric. According to multiple intelligence leaks, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, yes, the same IRGC that plotted drone attacks in Iraq and trained militias in Syria, has finalized missile packages aimed at U.S. positions across the region. The orders are prepared. The red lines are drawn. So we ask, what if those lines are crossed? What if the next Iranian missile doesn't hit an empty desert, but a crowded barracks? What happens when American soldiers die not in Afghanistan, not in a counter-terrorism raid, but in a retaliatory strike in a conflict the U.S. was supposed to be watching from the sidelines? This isn't a hypothetical built on fantasy. This is a scenario built on real-time events. The diplomatic collapse is already happening. The war rhetoric is already escalating. And Trump, back in full command of U.S. foreign policy, is reportedly considering military action in support of Israel. American destroyers are en route to the eastern Mediterranean. Fighter squadrons are being retasked. Troop deployments are underway. All it would take now is one spark, just one, to tip the U.S. from backroom ally into frontline target. So let's pull that thread. Let's imagine what unfolds in the hours, days, and weeks after diplomacy collapses, after Iran does what it says it will do and strikes an American base. What happens next? How does the Pentagon respond? How does Trump frame it? What do allies say? What do adversaries do? And how many fronts would ignite if that single missile kills just 5 Americans? Or 10? Or 50? You see, this is not a story about what-ifs anymore. This is a story about what happens when. Because in the Middle East, when diplomacy dies, escalation doesn't wait in line. It kicks the door open. It shatters the timeline. And suddenly, what we thought was a region on edge becomes the world on fire. By the time the Geneva talks fell apart, the tone had already shifted across every capital involved. France's foreign minister was the first to speak publicly, calling the breakdown regrettable but not irreversible. But even as he delivered those carefully worded lines, his aides were already in contact with defense officials, not peacekeepers. Berlin went silent. London issued a statement urging all parties to exercise maximum restraint, a phrase so tired, it might as well have been pre-scheduled. But the real noise came from Tehran. In a speech broadcast less than an hour after leaving the negotiating table, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi delivered what sounded less like diplomacy and more like an ultimatum. His words, "The United States has armed, funded, and directed Israeli aggression. If they believe they can strike us by proxy and remain untouched, they are mistaken." Behind that message was something much darker, a military calculus already in motion. According to multiple European and Gulf intelligence channels, Iran had, days earlier, moved ballistic units into launch positions near its western border. Satellite imagery showed reinforced activity near Khorramshahr and the Kermanshah missile base. two sites known for storing Shahab and Zulfikar missile systems. Not defensive positions, offensive ones, and not pointed at Israel, this time, but west and south. So what triggered this sudden shift from negotiation to targeting? It wasn't just one strike. It was a pattern. Over the past 72 hours, Israeli warplanes, armed with bunker busters, hit a research site near Natanz, leveled an intelligence office in Qom, and reportedly killed a senior IRGC general in a drone strike just outside Isfahan. These were not speculative attacks. These were systematic. Iran saw them not as acts of war alone, but as acts of coordination, with Washington pulling the strings. In public, the U.S. administration denied direct involvement. No official order, no American bomb. But Iran doesn't care about the signature on the missile. They care about the surveillance drone that helped it fly straight, the satellite feed that timed it perfectly, the regional radar systems, many American-operated, that helped Israel evade countermeasures. In other words, from Tehran's perspective, the U.S. isn't just backing Israel. It's in the war already. And so, in classic IRGC logic, the next step becomes almost predictable. If America is in the war, then American targets are now legitimate. That's not bluster. It's doctrine. And the list of targets is long. Bases in Iraq like Al-Assad and Erbil, facilities in Kuwait and Bahrain, naval assets in the Gulf, even soft targets, consulates, logistics depots, green zone bunkers in Baghdad, are fair game under Iranian threat models. According to leaks from CENTCOM briefings this morning, the Pentagon believes Iran has at least 12 precision-guided missile packages loaded and targeted within a 2-hour launch window. Some are Shahab class, others Fateh 110s, all capable of reaching U.S. bases within minutes. Not warning shots, kill shots. Meanwhile, on the American side, movement has already begun. 2 U.S. Navy destroyers are rerouting toward the Strait of Hormuz. F-22 squadrons in Qatar are now on standby for regional patrols. Carrier Strike Group 9, previously stationed near Guam, has been rerouted toward the Arabian Sea. And while no official statement has been made by the White House, senior Trump advisors have reportedly drawn up options for limited retaliatory strikes on Iranian radar sites and command bunkers, what they're calling a controlled response protocol. But make no mistake, once the first American is killed, no response stays controlled for long. The machinery of retaliation in Washington doesn't slow down. It accelerates. And that is precisely what Iran is counting on, because they believe America will overreact. And that overreaction is what they will exploit on every other front they've prepared. So yes, Geneva failed. But what's coming isn't a diplomatic void. It's a military cascade. And it starts with one trigger, an Iranian missile, launched in the name of justice, flying toward a base no American thought would ever become a war zone again. Let's not pretend history hinges on huge, sweeping events. Often, it's the details that kill. The overlooked signal, the misinterpreted message, the small incident that seems forgettable until it isn't. In the case of the US, Iran, and Israel, these trigger points are not theoretical. They are evolving in real time. And if we want to understand how we might wake up to news that a US base in Iraq was struck by Iranian missiles, we need to look at these moments closely, because the future turns on them. Trigger point 1. The killing of Iranian scientists and generals. The first, and perhaps most potent, trigger is the Israeli campaign itself. Over the past month, a string of Israeli airstrikes have done more than damage infrastructure. They've eliminated people, key people, nuclear scientists, missile technicians, IRGC commanders. Not just soldiers on the front lines, but architects of Iran's strategic posture. And Tehran doesn't see these attacks as isolated. They see them as systemic decapitation strikes, made possible by U.S. intelligence. Think about it. A strike on an Iranian research lab requires satellite precision, real-time movement data, and signal intercepts. Who dominates those capabilities in the region? The United States. That's the logic playing in Tehran's war rooms. If America enables the kill, it owns the consequence. So as more of Iran's elite fall under Israeli missiles, the pressure builds to make the U.S. feel that same loss. Not abstractly, physically. A base, a barracks, a body count. That's how they answer blood for blood. Trigger point 2. Trump's red lines and military rhetoric. The second pressure point is far more familiar. The political theater of American power. Donald Trump, now again commanding U.S. foreign policy, has never been known for subtlety. Behind closed doors, sources report he's already frustrated that America looks weak in the region. In public, his statements have been calculated, but barely. He said the U.S. won't tolerate attacks on its friends. That all options are on the table. And most recently, during a press stop in Arizona, he said, Iran will regret touching a single American. What does that mean to Tehran? It means Trump wants a provocation. And the more Iran holds back, the more they believe they are ceding the narrative. They're hardliners, many of whom were shaped by the trauma of the Iran-Iraq War, view restraint not as wisdom, but as humiliation. And so they push for a strike, not on civilians, not on embassies, but on uniformed American troops. Because to them, that's not terrorism, it's symmetry. If Trump says Iran must surrender or suffer, then Iran sees no option but to call that bluff. Trigger point 3. U.S. military logistics as legitimate targets. The third, and most diplomatically dangerous, factor is the invisible support structure beneath Israel's campaign. The refueling tankers, the early warning radar, the encrypted comms relays bouncing through CENTCOM networks. These are not speculative links. These are operational truths. And Iran knows them. What's happening now is that Tehran is beginning to treat those systems not as neutral infrastructure, but as battlefield nodes. The shift is conceptual but consequential. Once Iran deems U.S. support assets as extensions of the Israeli war machine, they no longer see the U.S. as a third party. They see it as the enabler. And under that logic, the U.S. military presence becomes not a peacekeeping force, but a legitimate threat. This is where the danger crystallizes. Because if Iran now sees every U.S. airbase, every ship in the Gulf, every depot in Erbil as part of the enemy chain, then it doesn't need to wait for American jets to fire. It just needs to strike the next link in that chain. And the chain is everywhere. It wraps through Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait. It is deeply embedded, highly visible, and, above all, vulnerable. And Iran is watching. So we are left with a chilling conclusion. The missile that could start the next war doesn't need to carry a nuclear payload. It doesn't need to hit Washington or New York or Tel Aviv. It just needs to fall, accurately, on a base where American soldiers sleep. And from that moment forward, everything changes. Because America does not bury its troops quietly. It retaliates. And from retaliation comes escalation. And from escalation comes the very scenario we've feared all along. The death of restraint. The end of regional conflict. And the beginning of something far harder to contain. So let's play it forward. Let's imagine the moment when Iran finally stops issuing threats and starts firing missiles. The moment when all three trigger points converge: more Israeli strikes, inflammatory rhetoric from Washington, and Iranian leadership deciding there's nothing left to lose. It begins, not with a grand declaration, but with movement. Satellite reconnaissance picks up IRGC missile trucks repositioning near Kermanshah and Al-Waz. Communication traffic between IRGC Aerospace Command and its missile brigade surges. U.S. intelligence notices the spike, flags it internally, but with no attack launched yet, there's no public alert. No statement. No evacuation. Just eyes watching and clocks ticking. Then, just after 2 a.m. local time, the first launch is confirmed. Shahab 3 and Fateh 313 missiles, guided by precision GPS, arc high into the night sky, heading west toward Iraq, toward the U.S. base at Al-Assad. Within minutes, the air raid sirens at Al-Assad scream to life. Soldiers scramble from bunks to hardened shelters. Emergency response protocols activate, but the lead time is short. Too short. The base's missile defense systems engage, but they're built to intercept drones and short-range rockets, not heavy ballistic missiles raining down in coordinated volleys. Several warheads get through. The impact is catastrophic. The Central Command building takes a direct hit. A dormitory wing partially collapses. Fuel depots ignite. Initial reports are chaotic, conflicting. Then the Pentagon confirms it, multiple American casualties. Between 10 and 50 injured. Possibly more. Emergency medical flights are deployed. Combat search and rescue helicopters race in under cover of darkness. The flames can be seen from miles away. In Washington, the news arrives before sunrise. Trump is briefed in the Situation Room. His reaction is swift and personal. He views the attack not just as an assault on U.S. personnel, but as a direct insult to American deterrence. Within the hour, CENTCOM is ordered to prepare a response. But there's a political complication. Trump wants a broad strike, command bunkers, missile sites, possibly even naval assets off the Iranian coast. But back in Congress, the War Powers Act suddenly comes into play. Democrats, and some Republicans, demand a vote before deeper action is taken. The House schedules an emergency session. Meanwhile, the military draws up options: airstrikes on IRGC headquarters, cyber attacks on Iranian air defense networks, and targeted strikes on missile facilities used in the attack. Back in the Middle East, the U.S. isn't waiting for votes. Air assets already in the region, F-15s from Al-Dhafra, drones from Al-Udeid, are in the air within hours. The retaliation begins. Iranian radar stations near Awaz go dark. A command center in Khorramshahr is leveled. Several launch sites are cratered. The U.S. Department of Defense announces that these are defensive, proportionate responses. But Tehran sees them differently, and they aren't responding alone. Almost immediately, Iran activates its proxy networks. In Lebanon, Hezbollah begins launching rockets toward Israeli northern defenses, drawing Israel deeper into a two-front war. In Yemen, Houthi drones are sent towards Saudi oil infrastructure and American shipping lanes. In Syria and Iraq, Shia militias fire rockets at coalition outposts, some manned by American and European troops. Suddenly, the war is no longer one country versus another. It's a mesh of overlapping battles, from the Red Sea to the Tigris River. And U.S. forces, once intended to deter conflict, are now in the thick of it, under fire across multiple locations, stretching supply chains, overwhelming medevac capacity, and forcing new deployments by the hour. And while military commanders try to hold the line, the information war explodes. Iran releases footage of their strike as a message to imperialists. Trump tweets, "Iran will pay the ultimate price for American lives." The hashtag WW3 begins trending globally. Oil futures spike instantly. Stock markets across Asia open in the red. The world has shifted, and the question is no longer if the U.S. is in the war. It's how far it will go, and how many other nations will be dragged in with it. While missiles crisscross the Middle East, Washington becomes its own war zone, one of rhetoric, alliances, and panic. The moment the Pentagon confirms American casualties, Capitol Hill erupts into two camps, one waving flags, the other waving legal documents. The first to speak publicly is Senator Lindsey Graham, appearing on Fox News within the hour, calling the Iranian strike a direct act of war and urging the president to unleash American power. Behind him are Republican leaders lining up in predictable formation, demanding swift justice, broader targeting authorities, and immediate deployment of reinforcements to the Gulf. But not all the support is uniform. Some of the more isolationist voices on the right, those tied to the America First doctrine, begin to waver. Figures like Senator Rand Paul express concern that the U.S. is sleepwalking into another endless war in a region Americans increasingly want to forget. They warn that defending bases is one thing, but launching another full-scale intervention? That's quite another. Across the aisle, Democrats are fractured. The centrist bloc, including military veterans and national security hawks, issues carefully worded support for defending U.S. personnel, but also pushes back on escalation. Progressive lawmakers, already skeptical of American military presence in the Middle East, go further, demanding a full congressional vote before any new strikes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a coalition of anti-war voices call for hearings on whether U.S. support for Israeli operations contributed to this fallout. The War Powers Act, dusty but suddenly urgent, becomes the center of the legal battle. Resolutions begin to circulate. Some seek to authorize defensive military action. Others demand a 30-day limit unless Congress explicitly approves further war. The tension between Article 2 powers and legislative oversight now sits like a live wire across the government. But it's not just politicians speaking. The American public, long weary of military entanglements in the region, is suddenly awake and deeply split. A flash poll conducted by CNN shows that 68% of Americans support retaliating against Iran for the deaths of U.S. troops. but only 34% support sending more soldiers into the region. In other words, Americans want punishment, but not war. And on the streets, protests begin to form. College campuses host vigils. Outside the White House, demonstrators chant, "No more wars for oil, no more bodies for ego." Across from them, pro-military counter-protesters wave the stars and stripes and chant, "Defend our troops." The national temperature begins to rise. And not just in Washington. In cities like Houston, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles, communities with large Middle Eastern diasporas stage demonstrations of their own. Iranian Americans, Iraqi Americans, Arab American coalitions, all warning that this war could bring more than bombs. It could bring fear, surveillance, even hate crimes. Meanwhile, media outlets enter frenzy mode. On the right, cable networks display ominous graphics, glowing Iranian missiles over maps of U.S. bases. On the left, roundtable panels question intelligence, replaying the ghosts of Iraq. On social media, the hashtags multiply, hashtag WW3, hashtag troops not targets, hashtag no to war, hashtag Iran strikes back, hashtag American lives. Inside the White House, Trump's team scrambles to control the message. Press secretary allies spin the strikes as a sign of Iran's desperation. Trump himself goes live on national television, flanked by generals, to promise a measured but decisive response. He uses phrases like American dominance and peace through strength. But to many ears, it sounds less like strategy and more like spectacle. And here's the strategic trap that's forming. The deeper the domestic divide becomes, the more the U.S. response fragments, not just politically, but operationally. The military wants clarity. Congress wants restraint. The president wants momentum. The public wants security without sacrifice. But wars don't wait for consensus. And while Washington argues, Iran mobilizes. Its proxies become more active. Its allies issue new warnings. Its leaders frame the American debate as weakness, proof that the U.S. lacks the will to finish what it starts. And that perception, dangerous in any conflict, may be exactly what pulls more nations into this escalating web. Because in war, perception can be more dangerous than firepower. By the third day after the Iranian strike on al-Assad, the shockwaves have reached far beyond the cratered runways and damaged barracks in Iraq. The tremor has rippled through every major capital, embassy, stock exchange, and shipping lane. The Middle East, already volatile, has become a chessboard with too many players and no shared rules. Let's start with the immediate regional effect. Iraq, already burdened by political gridlock and divided loyalties, finds itself pushed to the brink. The government in Baghdad attempts to walk a tightrope, denouncing the violation of its sovereignty while quietly coordinating emergency protocols with U.S. forces. But Iran-backed militias in Iraq, emboldened by Tehran's direct confrontation, begin launching their own attacks on U.S. outposts and convoys. The U.S. responds defensively, and suddenly, what was a single strike has become a mosaic of low-intensity clashes across multiple Iraqi provinces. In Syria, where Iranian and Russian forces maintain strategic depth, U.S. Special Forces outposts come under indirect fire. Drones are scrambled, air cover is requested, and once again, the conflict map stretches wider. Meanwhile, the Persian Gulf becomes a nerve center. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, 21-mile-wide channel through which 1/5 of the world's oil flows, turns into a minefield. Iranian patrol boats begin harassing shipping vessels. Tanker insurance premiums quadruple overnight. Some vessels reroute entirely, choking supply chains and delaying deliveries across Asia and Europe. One Japanese oil carrier suffers a near miss from what analysts believe is a sea drone, the maritime equivalent of a roadside bomb. The U.S. Navy responds by deploying additional destroyers and surveillance aircraft to the region. Tensions escalate. A standoff between an Iranian corvette and a U.S. frigate leads to a 90-minute game of brinkmanship. Radar locks, warning shots, scrambled jets. It stops short of war, but just barely. Now zoom out. The impact isn't just military. It's diplomatic and deeply fractured. The United Nations convenes an emergency session, but the meeting quickly descends into familiar gridlock. Russia and China, firmly opposed to U.S. action and skeptical of Israeli motives, refuse to back any resolution supporting American retaliatory strikes. They accuse Washington of triggering escalation through illegal intervention and warn against dragging the region into another imperial war. The U.S. ambassador walks out of the chamber. In Europe, the mood is one of frustration and fatigue. France and Germany condemn the Iranian missile attack, but they're also wary of the Trump administration's handling of the crisis. Their diplomats push for a renewed Geneva framework, though privately they acknowledge the chances are slim. Italy and the Netherlands suggest limited sanctions on Iran. Poland pushes for NATO consultations under Article 4, but consensus is elusive. Even within NATO, cracks show. Turkey, walking its own tightrope between East and West, urges de-escalation but refuses to host any new U.S. troop buildup. Hungary and Slovakia express concern about refugee flows. The alliance holds together, barely. And then, of course, comes the economic shock. Oil prices spike above $108 a barrel by day 4. Energy markets reel. Nations like India, heavily dependent on Gulf oil, announce emergency reserves will be tapped. China, already preparing for contingency, accelerates alternative shipping through Pakistan's Gwadar port and Russian pipelines. But it's not just oil. Global stock markets dip sharply. The S&P 500 drops 3% in a single day. The Nikkei plunges 5% on fears of global slowdown. The MSCI Emerging Markets Index falls for 6 straight sessions. Wall Street trading floors buzz with controlled chaos. Bond markets react violently. U.S. 10-year Treasury yields drop as investors flee to safety. The dollar strengthens. Emerging market currencies spiral. In Argentina, Brazil, and Egypt, economies already on edge, inflation spikes within a week. Food prices begin to climb in Africa and Southeast Asia as transport bottlenecks widen. Central banks respond. The European Central Bank holds emergency calls. The Bank of Japan intervenes in currency markets. The Fed faces pressure to balance recessionary fears with rising inflation from oil shocks. Analysts warn that a sustained conflict could trigger a global slowdown within a quarter. And amidst all this, global corporations scramble to adapt. Airlines cancel flights over Iraqi and Iranian airspace. Tech companies with data centers in the region begin relocating workloads. Oil majors like BP and Total evacuate non-essential personnel. Logistics firms reroute supply chains. The ripple effects extend not in weeks, but hours. This is what a single regional strike does to the global system when the right pieces are already misaligned. This is what it looks like when a localized flashpoint is set against a backdrop of geopolitical exhaustion, economic fragility, and diplomatic fragmentation. And what's most alarming? This is still only the beginning. In a crisis this volatile, clarity is scarce. Every side believes it's acting rationally. Every move is justified, until it isn't. That's why the next phase of this confrontation hinges on something deceptively simple, a cost-benefit analysis. Cold, clinical, strategic. So let's break it down. Scenario 1. Deterrence is established. From the U.S. perspective, the immediate military response, the destruction of Iranian radar sites, the neutralization of missile batteries, sends a clear message. You cannot kill American troops without paying a steep price. If Iran takes the hit and pauses further action, that message sticks. For Washington, it's a recalibration of deterrence, not a declaration of war. This outcome might even bolster Trump's image as a hard-nosed leader who punishes without plunging into another long war. Domestically, it allows Republicans to frame the conflict as a success. We showed strength, Iran backed down. For Iran, swallowing that punch is painful, politically and symbolically, but it might serve a purpose. A limited clash reminds both enemies and allies that Iran is willing to act, but also calculated. It restores a sense of parity after a year of Israeli aggression, and it rallies regional support, especially among Shia networks. But there's a catch. This scenario assumes rational restraint. That Iran will stop after a single base strike. That the U.S. won't go beyond measured retaliation. And that proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iraqi militias, will follow orders rather than instincts. History suggests that's a lot to ask. Scenario 2. The escalation spiral. Here's the darker path, the one that's easier to fall into and nearly impossible to exit. Iran sees U.S. retaliation not as proportionate, but as humiliating. More commanders are killed. Communications hubs are crippled. Tehran's leadership, already facing internal pressure, calculates that restraint equals weakness. So they strike again, this time at U.S. naval assets or embassies. Hezbollah launches deeper into Israel. Yemen's Houthis threaten Red Sea commerce. Now the U.S. must decide, escalate again or hold. Trump, with re-election pressures and a hardliner base, chooses escalation. And suddenly, you've crossed a line. The war is no longer tit for tat. It's systemic. You start seeing American forces engaging in multi-front combat in Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, and maybe Lebanon. Israeli air power is stretched thin. U.S. bases require more protection. Logistics chains become targets. Allied nations like Jordan and Saudi Arabia come under pressure to choose sides. Russia might not enter the war directly, but it can wreak havoc through cyber attacks, electronic warfare, and diplomatic sabotage at the UN. China, seeing American distraction, steps up naval maneuvers in the South China Sea, sensing opportunity. North Korea tests a missile just because it can. And back home, the American people, who might have tolerated one airstrike, now see body bags returning. The war drums become unbearable. Approval ratings fluctuate. Anti-war protests fill the streets. Support for escalation fractures. By now, the global economy is spiraling. Oil's well over $120. Freight costs triple. Refugee flows resume. And the international diplomatic community? Paralyzed. Scenario 3. Regional stability through chaos. There's a paradox here, a dangerous one. Some analysts argue that a limited confrontation could actually stabilize the region in the long run. That after a painful clash, red lines become clearer. Iran, burned by retaliation, reconsiders proxy aggression. The U.S., sobered by casualties, resets its force posture. Israel, no longer operating in the shadows, faces greater scrutiny. This is what some call the teachable violence theory, that a punch in the mouth restores balance. But history is not so tidy. The Middle East doesn't stabilize by accident. It calcifies. It hardens. And any short-term calm is often the result of exhaustion, not resolution. Scenario 4. Global backlash and strategic isolation. Then comes the final risk, the one often ignored in war rooms: perception. If the U.S. is seen as escalating a regional war for Israel's sake, it risks alienating not just adversaries, but allies. European governments may express public support while quietly pulling back. The global South, already skeptical of American power, sees hypocrisy. Why so aggressive here, but not in Ukraine, Sudan, or Gaza? Diplomatically, Washington might find itself isolated in key forums. Economically, the conflict might embolden China and Russia to accelerate the creation of alternative trade networks, alternative currencies, alternative rules. This is the long game. And in this game, the battlefield isn't Iraq or Iran, it's global legitimacy. And once lost, that's harder to bomb back into place. So here we are, the moment we always come to in this podcast. The what-if moment, not just speculative, but existential. The moment we step out of headlines and war maps and ask the only question that really matters. What if this all slips out of control? Because at this point, the gears are grinding. Momentum has taken over. Leaders claim they're still making decisions, but really, they're reacting. Systems are reacting. Machines are moving. People are dying. And somewhere, in a base in Iraq, on a ship in the Gulf, or inside a drone command center in Nevada, a single decision, a misinterpreted radar signal, or a wrong GPS coordinate could light the fuse no one can stop. So what if that happens? What if the first Iranian missile strike on a U.S. base doesn't lead to deterrence, but opens a door to something no one wanted, but no one could walk away from? What if America, in trying to defend its soldiers, finds itself fighting a war it can't define, can't explain to its people, and can't end with airstrikes? What if this conflict becomes the next chapter in a long, unfinished book called The Forever War? But this time, it isn't just Afghanistan or Iraq. This time, the theaters multiply: Iran, Syria, Lebanon, the Red Sea, the Gulf, maybe even Taiwan, if rivals decide this is the moment to push. And here's the cruel irony of modern war. You can win every battle and still lose the war. You can kill every IRGC commander you target and still find yourself deeper in conflict. You can silence enemy air defenses and still lose your alliances, your credibility, your stability back home. Because modern war isn't about flags on hills anymore. It's about information, legitimacy, fatigue, and unintended consequences. So the real what if isn't, what if Iran strikes a US base? We've already played through that. The real what if is this. What if we're already inside the war? Not a declared one, not one with parades or congressional speeches, but a new kind of war. One that began not with tanks, but with diplomatic failures. Not with invasions, but with automated drones, proxy networks, and political inertia. A war that doesn't open with fanfare, but unfolds on Twitter, in press briefings, in anonymous intelligence leaks, in oil prices, and in fear. If that's true, if the war has already started, then the only question left is, do we double down, or do we wake up in time to change course? Because if we don't, if we keep pretending this is still theoretical, then the future will stop asking what if and start demanding, why didn't you? So where does that leave us? We've walked through the timelines, the missiles, the ministers. We've traced the arc from Geneva's failed diplomacy rooms to flaming US outposts in Iraq. We've seen how a regional crisis, already burning, could spiral into something far less containable, far more permanent. And here's the terrifying truth. None of this requires imagination. None of it is science fiction. Every scenario we've examined is built on real positions, real deployments, real rhetoric already happening in the world right now. The Geneva talks broke down in 3 hours. Iran's foreign minister publicly threatened US forces if they intervened. American warships are already on the move. And behind every headline, every diplomat statement, every press release from a defense ministry, there are people calculating what they can get away with before the world calls it a war. We now live in a moment where diplomacy collapses not with the sound of gunfire, but with silence. The absence of compromise, the retreat from the table, the shrug, the stall, the rehearsed line of "we're watching developments closely" while weapons systems lock into place. And when the bullets do start flying, as they might soon, we'll be told it happened quickly, that it was sudden. But you and I, we know better. It's never sudden. It's slow. It's layered. And by the time the public realizes how deep we're in, the concrete has already been poured. So what's the call here? It's not for optimism. Not yet. But maybe for clarity. If war begins with misunderstanding, maybe peace begins with admitting how close we are to tipping over. Because the people who will suffer most in this next war won't be the ones sitting in marble halls or briefing rooms. It will be the soldiers on the ground, the refugees crossing borders, the parents watching oil prices climb while groceries vanish from shelves, the civilians, always the civilians. And so we end this part of the story not with certainty, but with urgency. Because when diplomacy fails, escalation doesn't wait politely. It rushes in. And right now, it's knocking. If you've stayed with us this far, then you're likely already feeling what we're feeling. This isn't a hypothetical anymore. It's a trajectory, a pattern, a fuse that's been lit in the shadows and now snakes its way across borders, alliances, and decades of failed peace. So, let's be brutally honest for a moment. We're not here to scare you, but we are here to jolt you. To snap you out of the dull hum of headlines and make you ask yourself one thing. If diplomacy has already failed and Iran does strike US bases, what comes next? And can anyone truly stop it once it starts? Because the first explosion might not be the one that kills the most people. The deadliest blow might be the one that kills off restraint, kills off negotiation, kills off the last ounce of political will to talk instead of shoot. We've seen it before. And yet we keep acting like every new war is the first war. We act surprised when leaders backed into corners choose pride over prudence. We act surprised when red lines blur into blood. But history is not surprised. It's just waiting for us to pay attention. So as we leave you today, we won't offer false comfort. But we will offer this. The future doesn't have to be pre-written. It's still being drafted, every day, every decision, every voice raised for peace or swallowed by silence. Which side of that line do you want to be on? Because next time on What If Horizons, we're turning the lens eastward. As the Middle East burns, what happens if China sees its moment and seizes Taiwan? A second front, a second crisis, a second opportunity for disaster or deterrence. Don't miss it. Follow us. Subscribe. Share this episode with someone who still believes peace is possible, but understands it won't happen by accident. This is What If Horizons, where the question isn't just what if, but what now? Thanks for listening.